do it.
All right. Terrific. Hello. Hello there and welcome to Latest Developers. This is a session that will explore the ways that engineers and editors can best work together to further the goal of each of those groups, which is good journalism. I'm Greg Barber, Director of Digital News Projects at The Washington Post, and I am joined today by some of the best innovators in the business, each perched at the intersection of news and digital development. We'll do a round of introductions, and then each of them will give examples of the way that developers and editors have worked together in their newsrooms. We'll have a discussion after that, and then after that, we will take your questions. So off to the races. Do you want to start, John? Just introduce.
Hello, my name is John Crowley. I'm the editor-in-chief of the International Business Times in the UK. I just started the job 6 days ago, and I was formerly the digital editor of the Wall Street Journal for Europe.
Excellent, thank you, John. Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark Lavallee. I'm the editor of Interactive News at the New York Times, which is about 24 developer journalists who work in the newsroom on a variety of fun and exciting things.
Excellent. More fun and exciting things from Martin as well. Martin.
Yeah, I'm Martin Staube. I have the same job title, but at the Financial Times. And we describe it as a team of data journalists, designers, and developers tasked with developing new forms of digital storytelling.
And storytelling's a job of Mary's as well. Hi, Mary.
Hi, I'm Mary. I'm the executive editor for Audience at The Guardian, and I don't run a team of designers and developers. I run a team of people who rely on the work of designers and developers to do our jobs well.
Excellent. All right. And so from here, we are going to, each member of the team, each member of the panel here is going to do a quick presentation, and we'll start with John, and hopefully this works.
Let's take it back a little. Okay, well, hello everyone. As said, I'm just about 6 days into my new job, so great way to start it. Hello, I'm going off to Italy to do some serious work, which I am. Well, first of all, so I'm going to talk about a particular case study on a project that we worked that was a collaboration between 3 journalists, but which I think is indicative of the kind of the transformative way coders and developers in the newsroom, journalists come coders, unicorns, call them what you want, have had a real kind of big impact at the Journal, and I will be obviously just speaking about my experiences at the Journal for now. So the project that we decided to work on was something called What Greece Owes When, and you may have kind of forgotten it now, kind of 12 months on, but you know, Greece was in serious danger of exiting the euro last year. It had a new government in, Sorbets had come in, described as, you know, obviously far left government, and the markets were unsure about Greece's ability to pay off its debts. So what an intrepid reporter called Charles Sorrell, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the Journal, decided to do was to actually collate every single piece of debt scrap paper that Greece owed then from 2015 until 2054. And they had, Greece had 7 main creditors. None of them were in a central repository, so Charles had to kind of go to each of the organizations to kind of dig it out of them. So the IMF was actually surprisingly easy to get hold of. The Greek Data Office, actually, that was moderately easy, and funnily enough, it was the ECB, which you'd expect to be very slick. It actually took a really long time to do this, and so what was detailed with the different tranches, the terms, and the maturity dates. And this project took about 2 to 3 weeks. There's about 280 columns. All this was manually inputted, Charles did, with someone called Pat Majinski, known on Twitter as Chart Girl. And you know, they put tables, websites together, and this is all done on a kind of a Google spreadsheet. So enter Elliot Bentley, who is the so-called unicorn who sits on the graphics desk. He'd asked Charles to kind of put this all into this Google sheet, which he'd done, and he wanted to kind of display this in something that was called high charts. But what he needed from him was kind of particular JSON script which Charles had to write. So without getting too bogged down too technically into it, you know, Elliot was doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but he got Charles to write a script around this Excel spreadsheet. And this took about 3 days to complete. And this is kind of a snapshot of the top of the graphic. And you can see from left to right, you can see how Greece's debt was completely front-loaded last year. We didn't make any comment about this, but you could, you know, obviously come to your own conclusions fairly quickly about the, you know, the sorry state that Greece is in terms of having to pay its money. So this is, you could break this down. This plays a little video of what it's like. You can break this down into who the debt holders were, whether it was Treasury bill holders, the European Investment Bank. You know, you could look at particular years. And you know, this was something that was hugely successful for us. It stood on its own as a piece of work, but we also embedded this as well into our stories, and it got something like 360,000 unique views for a project like this. Was absolutely huge. And it was actually a kind of resource. No one had actually ever done this before as well. So we felt that we were doing kind of a public service job too. So as I said, you know, this is one example of a project, and you know, how did this come about? About 2.5 years ago, when I started as the digital editor at the Journal, we created also a new graphics desk, an interactive graphics desk. And we also happened pretty much at the same time, we happened to move from kind of dowdy offices where the graphics desk was kind of down, you know, right at the back of the room, out the back with the waiters, you know, kind of dishing things up, down to the front, right down to the hub. And they were put at the center of the conversation. You know, I remember when I started, the graphics desk didn't even come into our morning meeting. You know, they were dismissively seen as an offshoot. It was kind of like, it was something that was thought about after. And it wasn't just graphics, it was video as well. So, you know, these kind of projects, you know, wouldn't have happened at all. In terms of, you know, I think one of the questions was in terms of identifying, you know, talent, you know, particularly if you're kind of not a big news organization like the Wall Street Journal, where the data viz doesn't fit into the traditional newsroom model and there isn't technologists in the newsroom. You know, we've looked to journalism schools to, you know, to do it. Elliot Bentley himself got his job from the graphics editor from Jovi Juan by kind of, he did a 90-second pitch at a Hacks Hackers meetup in London. Yeah. You know, that's how he got the job on the strength of it. And in terms of takeaways, just very quickly, because I know I'm on the clock, this, you know, this kind of thing where 3 people work together, when you have a reporter who has that information in his head where he's collected it, he can work with a graphics person, was actually quite revolutionary for us, because, you know, in terms of the Journal, very much an old lady kind of in terms of American journalism being very legacy-based, cutting through a swathe of editors and just being able to do something, you know, very quickly, within a couple of weeks, something that was very successful, was, as I said, was revolutionary for us to do. And we've done several projects like this. The only thing that I would say is that probably what coders and programmers and graphics people are not good at is kind of shouting how good they are at doing it. You know, you need to evangelize. There's a PR job to be done in the newsroom as well as outside too. And as I explained, I've just started a new job. I'm hiring. If I do something half as good as, you know, the stuff that we've done at the Journal, I'll be very happy. So if you're interested in data journalism, get in touch with me afterwards.
And you can see how to do that up there. Great, thanks so much, John. And I'm going to be the weak link as we move from one to the next and pass this along. Great. To Mark.
Ordered these, so we're going to jump around a little bit. I'll set this up while I intro. So I think, you know, building off of what John's talking about you know, developers and designers getting really involved in individual stories and really being able to change the way that a story is told. Another role in the newsroom is being able to figure out how to tell repeatable stories and have repeatable templates that are you know, start from this kind of custom one-off operation, but can be sort of built to be more easily adapted and reused over time. And that is not just a step one, make the thing once. Step two, make the thing 1,000 times. It's a much more, it's much messier and more fraught process than that. I think one of the key things for people who are doing this is that they are able to wear multiple hats, that they are able to think as a journalist and act as a journalist on an individual story, and be able to sort of build that from start to finish, but then also apply sort of more rigor that you would sort of see in a more traditional software development shop to really figure out how to make that so that it works for people who are less technically skilled, that it works for someone in the Hong Kong bureau on a Saturday night for us, morning for them, and sort of be able to unlock the potential of the rest of the newsroom that way. So I'm going to walk through one example of how we've done this with lists. And like all good digital innovations, I'm going to start with print. So, going back a couple of years, this is a somewhat common pattern, at least in our newsroom, where someone has a special thing that's running in print and they want to make sure that it's special online as well. And we usually, on receiving these requests, kind of roll our eyes a little bit, but try to find a way to solve for them. So this, in this case, was something that came out of the home section, where they would profile the sort of small arts districts in different cities around the country. And so they'd cooked up this elaborate print presentation, and they wanted to make sure that it didn't just get, your scrolling is backwards.
Oh, yes, it is, sorry.
They want to make sure it didn't just end up as an article like this online. And so, in working with them, we talked about, well, we have, in our CMS, you can make articles, you can also make interactives. This is the wonderfully usable interface for making an interactive in the CMS at the New York Times, where you basically fill out all these fields, and then you dump all your code in here. Very easy. And, I'm sort of half kidding because we have, built tools so that we can do this ourselves. And be able to work essentially outside the law and then push all that stuff in at the last minute. But this workflow is really built around individual graphics and interactive. So we go through this work with them and we build this page and they like the page, which is great, except they come back 6 weeks later because they want it again for Philadelphia. And then they come back 6 weeks later because they want it again for Miami. And I think there's a Toronto in here too. You get the picture. And so, this in many other similar scenarios, sort of showed the need to actually be able to make a tool where they can make their own lists, and we can get out of the list-making game entirely. And so you take the people who are now well-versed in sort of custom-fitting these individual lists for different desks, and you want to be able to take those same people who have the most knowledge in doing that and give them the space to be able to then go off and build a tool with that knowledge and experience that they have. And so that's what we did in this case, was you sort of have to move people around. In our situation, you have to move people around to get them off of essentially the daily production grind in order to be able to do this. But really the sort of requirements they have in their head, I think, in our experience, are better than any sort of trying to write that down and hand that off to another team. So the thing about this list tool that we introduced into the newsroom last year is it's not sophisticated. Lists are simple things, right? You have items in a list, and you have some fields that you put in each item, and you fill those out and you hit the publish button. This is not magic, right? It's really just about creating the space to be able to make this possible, so that now this is where some things are missing. 1 second. Do you know?
It's right there, yeah.
Here's more. Look at that.
Oh.
No, it's okay. Let me just go like this. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So now people on desks can make their own fancy-looking lists without having to come to us. And those lists can include links and things, and they can include maps, which come from another tool. And they leave us alone, which is good for everybody. And so that's great, and that sort of has moved us, I think, much further along, where now at this point we've produced about 2,000 lists with this tool in the last year. And so those are 2,000 individual projects that we have not had to do ourselves. But in a different way, using that starting point, that new baseline, we still want the ability to be able to go in and mess with these things ourselves. And so this is something that came out of the same tool. It has a different layout. This is a feature in T Magazine where they send a bunch of like random things to two semi-famous people and then have them critique them. And so it has a very specific layout in print, and we were able to duplicate that online. This is sort of what people say when they're given a $2,930 doggy bag, which I didn't know was a thing until I was putting together these slides. So we're able to still do that level of customization. But I'd say the last piece about sort of the way that we work is that once you go into that more rigorous software development world, you don't want to close the door to being able to hack your own stuff. So the incredibly sophisticated approach we have to be able to do this ourselves when we want to really sort of like punch something up is a big box that we put code into. And that's basically the secret there. So this just sort of shows, I think, how putting people in the right space allows them to sort of move between these different worlds and apply their skills in different ways. And that can happen, those shifts can happen multiple times a day, even where they're moving back and forth. So that's it.
Excellent. And so that I don't have to keep these nice people waiting while I go in there and screw up someone else's presentation. A follow-up question for you. So when you were talking about getting people to move around and get out of the daily production grind, what are some of the things, some of the kind of mental sorbets that you've used for people on your team to sort of get them out of what they've been doing on a day-to-day and into something that can get them thinking in a different way?
I'd say for the folks on my team, it's usually pretty easy after being on the production treadmill for a while to be able to get them out. It's usually more working with the rest of the newsroom, because I think in a lot of our cases, we're fortunate at this point to be sort of partners with people who want to do things, not a service desk to people who want us to do things for them. It does mean that to make the time and space to work on something that is better for everybody, we have to say no to things in the interim, right? So yes, we said yes to that before, but now we're going to say no, but so that we can say yes again someday. That's if you care about that one story that you just want to see be nicer online, that sometimes can be a bit of a bargaining.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Mark. And Martin.
Right. A lot of that sounds very familiar to me. We have very similar dynamics, but we have a slightly different structure, which I'd like to go through and give some examples of how we divide up the work in that space. So we have, if you're interested in any of this, you can find the links here. So we actually have two separate teams of developers in our newsroom. One is my team, which is like I said, a group of journalists, designers, and developers, but there's also a separate thing called Editorial Technology. And the way they divide up their work is one produces content, code is content, essentially reader-facing material, and the other is sort of internal-facing and produces things that help us do better journalism across the newsroom. They're of roughly similar scale if you count them all up, but actually the Editorial Technology works very differently. It's much more of a traditional software development shop, as it was described, whereas Interactive News is kind of a modified news desk that produces content that happens to be sort of custom code. And so this is the sort of thing that we do on Interactive News. Election results is the classic thing. This is live updating throughout the night of an election, giving the results, visualizing them, personalizing them, as you see on the right. A lot of that's automated on a mobile phone. It will detect your location. These are sort of custom functionalities that you can really only build with a collaborative team of journalists, designers, and developers. But that's kind of the model that we've heard a lot about that exists at a lot of places now. Some of the other things that we do is start leaning a bit towards newsroom tools. This is our Chinese economy dashboard. iframe does not work in this browser. Okay. That's not unpleasant. But anyway, this shows a series of charts about the Chinese economy, particularly ones that are repeated over and over again, that we report on the movements in these indicators very commonly, and so often have to make the same chart or updated version of the chart that really just adds a few new data points to it. So what we did was we built a tool that automatically generates those charts that we know we use often. We call it Autograph. We use it internally. The reporters that cover economic data use these to quickly get the new chart that they need, updated live continuously. Again, you need a developer who knows what they're doing to generate charts like this, both on the front end, and we'll talk about different roles, both on the front end to design the charts, a data visualization specialist, but also someone kind of on the back end who's working with a server to build the automation process that gets the data in the first place and cleans the data and gets it ready to be made into a chart. And those are actually very separate skill sets, which isn't often apparent to journalists. And this previous example, this was an attempt to, I wish I could show you this, to create a public-facing version of this that kind of just shows off all of this work in a public-facing way. So we have dashboards of data for China, Japan, the United States, and the United Kingdom, and we're adding some other countries soon. One of the projects we're working on at the moment is about the referendum coming up in the UK. Again, we're doing a lot of stuff around the polling data that is being generated in huge volumes at the moment, trying to make sense of all of that. And one of the things that we've done that doesn't look like a whole lot, but this is an interactive graphic sitting on an FT homepage. This is something that was built in my team and was then pushed into the main code base for our new website called NextFT. Not everyone has access to this yet, so if this doesn't look familiar, it's because it's the beta version of the site. What you see here is the white strip across the top and the selection of stories underneath was built by the journalist developer in the newsroom and then pushed into the main code base. And so that's kind of blurring the traditional lines between the newsroom and the technology department of the organization. So that's kind of interactive news, but on the other side, this is Lantern, our internal analytics tool. What you see here is someone on a FT page clicks on a link in the Chrome extension, and that opens up the data about that story. So this is something we've been rolling out recently. Renee, who I see in the audience here, is leading that effort. And this is one of the journalist-facing tools that the editorial technology team has been making. Another example is Nightingale, our internal chart-making tool. And this is kind of for the other 99% of stories where you don't need the auto-generated charts, where you have some data in a spreadsheet or whatever, and you need to quickly make a chart tool. This is a good example of lightening the workload on the graphics specialists. There are many, many, many simple charts that journalists should be able to make for themselves, reporters should be able to make for themselves. You don't need a graphics specialist for. Just to give you an example, but one of the things that the editorial technology team has had to add to the normal workflow of the technology team is a sort of rollout process of training people how to use these things. They've made them as easy to use as possible, but there's still a process of education that needs to be added. And by having people in the newsroom and having the technologists in the newsroom and really understanding the constraints that journalists work under, both time pressure and existing skills and resources at their disposal, lets them make tools that are most appropriate for those conditions. And so just to give you an idea of how simple we've made making an FT chart, here's a piece from the demo video that is embedded into that tool. Oh, wonderful. Great. Ah, that'll be why. Okay, well, that was really good. Is there internet access here somewhere? Anyway, well, let's skip ahead. Try to come back to that. Oh, that was the last slide. So a bit anticlimactic, but I'll see if I can get that up after Mary's talked.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Martin, and apologies for the link at the end. A follow-up question for you while Mary gets going there, and it'll be on the PowerPoint program there down at the bottom. You were talking about the sort of training process that you had to go through with some of the tools. What is your interactive team's involvement in that training process? Is there sort of a group of newsroom trainers who kind of manage that, or is it your team that does it?
No, there is a group of newsroom trainers, but I think what has happened with that tool in particular is the sort of testing process threw up. The testing process that is familiar from software development threw up training issues. So yeah. Editorial technology team that built that went out into the newsroom, showed people how to use it, and discovered very quickly that some of the challenges weren't about the user interface. They weren't about the design of the tool. They were largely about journalists' existing knowledge about how to source and clean data. They were about people's knowledge of how to get things from one of our internal systems into another. So it's great if you can make an image, but you don't know how to upload that image into the CMS because you've never been taught that. It's never been your job before. Yeah. Suddenly you realize that there's training issues rather than technology issues. Yeah. And you don't really discover those unless the technologists doing the testing are actually in the newsroom watching people use their material.
Yeah. Well, because that's one of the challenges, right? That you wind up in a scenario where, something may be a training issue, but it presents to the newsroom as if, oh, this tool doesn't work.
Right.
Yeah. And then newsrooms notoriously kind of close off, tool doesn't work, not using it again.
Yep, and that's a very familiar story. If it doesn't instantly work exactly as you expect it, it will be rejected by the users and not used. And so this is really crucial. Yeah.
No, we're notoriously choosy in newsrooms. Cool. Yeah. Thanks so much, Martin. And Mary.
Hello. So I'm going to talk about 4 kind of different examples of projects that the Guardian's run through and done. Possibly. There we go. Hey, it works. So I was going to talk quickly about kind of 4 different things, 2 kind of reader-facing, audience-facing projects, and 2 kind of internal projects of the sort that Martin was talking about. So this is The Counted. The Counted is a massive database that we've been maintaining for almost a year now of police killings in the US. And the reason that we started to do this is that the US authorities don't do this. So as in kind of 2014 and last year, as city after city was being galvanized by these enormous protests after the deaths of people at the hands of the police, we started to build this database, and we used Google Docs, and we used news alerts, and we used local media reporting and other people's crowdsourced databases, and we also built a big crowdsourcing system of our own. And we built this absolutely beautiful interactive. And by we, I mean the US interactives team built that. And God bless them, it is an incredible thing. And the FBI is building its own database now, drawing on our methodology, and I believe also the Washington Post, who did a similar project. And this runs entirely off a Google Doc that sits in the background. I have no idea how it does it. It's basically magic. But it is an astonishing thing because it allows you to come along and to explore and investigate the data in aggregate, but it also shows you the faces, as far as we can get them, of every single person who died in the US during an encounter with the police last year. This database was built from the very start because of the involvement of that team in the newsroom, with the idea of being able to use it as a catalyst to learn more about these people. So you can explore these people as individuals, you can explore news coverage not just on our own site but also elsewhere about them. And the fact that you can take each one of these cards and share it individually meant that as part of our crowdsourcing work, we were able to actually go out to people, go out to our communities and say, this has happened, this is what we know, this is all that we know right now, do you know more? Come tell us, we're trying to find this out. And because we were developing the crowdsourcing alongside the interactive during this kind of planning process, it has a really, really lovely interactive back end that allows the social teams to update avatars based on the count changing every day, because it changes every day, and to go into detail on each of the individual deaths without needing to go back and take screenshots. We were able to use this interactive as the start point for all of that outreach work. And the net result of that is that the interactive was viewed more than 1 million times last year across the course of the year. We had more than 1,000 tips from our community, and a huge number of those tips were people who were following up something that we already knew a little bit about, but people wanted to tell us more, were able to tell us more because we were able to get the word out so easily. And none of that would be possible if this was a flat page or if we hadn't been so kind of heavily meshed into the planning process right from the very beginning. And there's another example where the data actually informs and becomes the journalism. This is the start of the UK office's Millennials series. So we looked at Gen Y, young adults in the UK, and how they've been affected by various issues. And huge amounts of that work were built on economic data, data about debt, data about unemployment, data about property, and all of these impacts on young people between the ages of 18 and 35. And our data journalism team in the UK used R to analyze a bunch of this data and to visualize it and to come up with these sort of gorgeous graphics and interactives that allow you to go, oh, I really can't buy a house. Oh. And to kind of really illustrate that problem and allow people to dig more deeply into the details of it. And then on the journalist-facing side, though, again, we have teams of people who, teams of technologists who create the tools that our journalists use. So this is OFAN, which is our live data store. It's, I think, about 4 years old now. And it's been slowly growing and it's been being iterated out. And it's designed exactly around the questions that journalists and editors ask about their work. And the net result of that is that last month, more than 1,000 people within The Guardian used this to get information about the way that our audience is using the website and then to make decisions based on that information. And this all began because Chris Moran, who is our audience editor, got together a group of developers and said, I have a really interesting problem. Does anybody want to help me solve it? This wasn't born out of a feature request. It wasn't born out of something where a journalist went, you know, it'd just be really nice if this thing happened. It was born out of somebody saying, I have a problem and I need help to solve it, and giving away the ownership of what that solution ought to look like to a larger group of people and working on solving it together. The other example of that is Composer. This is our CMS. And it's really pretty. Most CMSs are horrible pieces of software to use. It's one of the reasons why Medium is so well loved as a thing to write in. And Composer actually started out as our live blogging tool because our old CMS, R2, didn't really let us live blog and let us display live blogs in ways that we wanted to. But we just kept iterating and we kept talking, and the newsroom kept talking to the technology, the tools team who was building this tool. And now it looks like this, and it powers every single article on the Guardian site. And it also has a really beautiful picture database attached because the picture database wasn't quite working as well as it could, and now this is designed from the ground up, again, to be the best possible tool and the best possible system for making journalism that includes an image. So it's possible now to get a piece up in seconds if it's a breaking news tool. The number of sort of necessary fields is as low as possible, so that if something is happening right now and you just need to get 2 sentences onto the website, it's doable. But it's also possible to take ages and make absolutely gorgeous, kind of deep, beautiful, picture-led formats. And it serves everything else in between. And part of the reason why it does that, it has that versatility, is because at every step of the way, there's people in the newsroom involved in the process, and often there's people building the tools sitting in the newsroom going, can I just look at how you do? No, it's a breaking news thing. I'll be very quiet. Okay, yeah, you're doing it like that. Brilliant. Okay, I know what I need to know now. And it's that co-location and that very close working that means that you end up with tools that everybody can use really, really easily. So yeah, that's us.
Yeah. Well, and so a follow-up question on that collaborative process. So in the police killings project, just that sharing feature, just the ability to share each of the cards was really interesting. How much coordination do you know was there between the folks who were building that and the social team to think through, how would sharing be useful here? How would we want to do it? What would sort of be the strategy around it? And then the sort of crowdsourcing that you did after that.
Quite a lot. It's an interesting team because the team involves reporters, researchers, the interactive journalists, and also the audience team who were. So I was devising strategy around how we would get the audience, how we would reach an audience of people who care very much about this issue, but not necessarily about The Guardian. So starting with the idea that there's a huge community of people in the US who care very, very deeply in one way or the other about police violence, and then trying to find ways of reaching those people wherever they were. So we realized quite early on we'd need to build a community away from our own site, away from our own platform in order to get those people involved. And also that when people care about this issue, they care generally because somebody that they know, somebody in their community, something has happened, and to which they have a personal connection. So giving those people something that was that personal rather than just, here is a very big number, but here is an individual, this is a person, something happened to that person, I knew that person. And giving people the capacity to talk, the capacity to tell their own stories on an individual level was hugely important.
Yeah.
I'll tell you an interesting thing though. Initially we were using the names and the dates as unique identifiers for hashes in the URL to get to the right card. But there were so many shootings and so many killings where we didn't have a name, the unnamed plus the date was bringing up 3 or 4 different entries. And we had to move to different methods so that it would be possible for us to share each case where we didn't have a name yet individually and say, do you know what happened? Can you tell us more? Without just having to share the entire batch all at once.
Yeah. No, sobering work and a really exciting project. Martin, is your video good to go?
Yeah, I could show you that.
Okay,
video.
excellent.
So this is one of our. So this is one of the training videos that we included with the Nightingale package in response to sort of realizing that people needed to really be shown how to use something, even though it was designed to be as intuitive as possible. So this is the process. The last couple of seconds, most of this video, as you see, is kind of dedicated to cleaning up the data and preparing it in Excel. And this kind of goes back to a bit of what Linda mentioned. Journalists don't like to put their hands up and admit that they don't know how to use Excel. So by putting it on YouTube, you avoid having to sort of fess up to that. And here's the sort of final step of the process, which kind of shows that we've tried to make it as simple as possible. There are very few dials and knobs and things to change here, because the tool is designed to interpret the data that the journalist gives it and make a guess as to what the journalist is trying to do.
Control-C to copy the data. And then open Nightingale and click within this fast text box here. And hit Control-V to paste the data into the tool. As you can now see, the data is in Nightingale and I'm ready to begin making my chart.
And that's it.
Terrific, thanks for that. And yeah, if I haven't given the director in here enough reasons to want to kill me, I told him there was no sound. So apologies if you couldn't hear that, but that was really tremendous. So each of the projects that you've mentioned involves a lot of collaboration, right? So and planning and preparation. When you're thinking about projects of this magnitude, what's the first question that you or a member of your team asks when you're in the process of beginning a project?
Well, I'll jump in before you. Well, first of all, who's in charge? Who's running it? I think.
Yeah.
I think you need to have a kind of a project manager, and once you said that, you actually want to stop the number of core people who are in it. You don't want it to get too unwieldy. Mm-hmm. There's a project that we worked on a couple of years ago, which was 100 legacies from World War I, where we did 100 different cards on kind of the impacts of World War I 100 years on. And actually, what we agreed was not to, so we agreed that we were going to run it, and then we just said, right, it's going to be only about 8 or 9 of us, because which was big enough anyway, because if you started, telling other people, getting other people into it, you'd give yourself a reason for them just to say no anyway. So I think a project leader and a strong kind of tight-knit group of core people who are working on the project, and then your line managers or whoever can be kind of copied in occasionally, but I think it needs that core group at the start.
I think in terms of thinking about how ambitious you want to get with a given story idea or sort of theme of story ideas, there's kind of a Jekyll and Hyde role for us, where if the desk is skeptical, we try to sort of be cheerleaders for thinking about things different ways and sort of show them what's possible and so on. But there are other times where they come to us and they're really excited about doing something digital. They don't really know what it is, and we kind of have to like push back on them to essentially explain back to us why it's worth doing something that's not just text and photos, to get them to basically just think more with more sort of like digital literacy about when we should be applying various techniques and how often we should be using them.
So one of our first questions that we always talk about is define the user need, and the user in the case of most of our work is a reader, And so the question then becomes, why are existing ways of doing this not sufficient? The desire to create something fancy and is not really a sufficient case for deploying what are very expensive resources. There needs to be a really strong case, and one of the things that we've done is to write those rules down and actually have a set of criteria by which we assess proposed projects. And that kind of highlights to the newsroom that we're dealing with a sort of established body of knowledge, both in our own newsroom and from others, about what works and what doesn't in this space, and that we're not just kind of making this up as we go along, and that we're not being difficult when we're saying no, and we're not being sort of madly enthusiastic when we want to take a story that the newsroom may not see as the utmost priority, but it seems to be in that sweet spot where interaction can really tell the story better.
Yeah. Nice. Do you have an answer to that?
I mean, I think one of the most important kind of elements to planning is actually legitimately asking the question, how can we best tell this story in a way that in a way that somebody is going to understand it and going to get the most out of the story that we actually tell. Because for a lot of newsrooms, especially print newsrooms or legacy print newsrooms, the default story is still 600 to 800 words of text. And you have to be persuaded, like a lot of news editors and a lot of newsrooms have to be persuaded away from that as the default and persuaded that something else is actually better. When in reality, a lot of the time the best thing to do is start with the story itself and say, how is this story best consumed? What do I want my audience to do with this? What do I want my audience to take away from this? How can I get them to understand this really complicated issue? Or even, how can I get them to understand this really simple thing? Sometimes stories are best told as, a graphic that you can put on Twitter. Sometimes stories are best told as 2,000-word epics. Sometimes stories are best told as games. There's a huge number of different affordances to different technologies. And in an ideal world where we all had infinite resources, every single story would obviously be told in the absolute, best way for that story. We don't live in that world, and we do have to prioritize. But I think that's a really key thing to be asking when it comes to these large projects.
But I think what we're trying to get at as well is that there is this rush then, it's like this rush to kind of, right, let's tell this story in a visual way without kind of thinking it through and making sure the right format kind of fits the story.
And even one last thing, it's like, I think even when you put tools out there to really be able to scale that up, you can see those end up getting overused as well, and it's really trying to teach, it's interesting to see your video documentation around this and training, because it's easy for the tool to sort of be this crutch that lets people sort of skip a number of critical thinking steps in the process and say, oh, well, and we made a list with this story, so they can just sort of check it off and sort of fighting against that kind of mentality.
Yeah. Well, kind of jumping off of that point, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you find when non-coding journalists and coding journalists tend to get together from either side? You're smiling.
Yeah, I'm smiling because as a non-coding journalist, one of the things I had to teach myself was the meaning of the word deadline. Because in my experience, for non-coding journalists, a deadline is the sort of thing that if you miss it, potentially the world ends. There's a hole in the newspaper or a hole in the program, and you don't miss a deadline. It is drilled into you from the very start of your career. And deadline for someone who grew up and has mostly worked on the coding side tends to be something that you aim for, but you might not get there. And it'll probably be about sort of 2 to 3 weeks after that when it's really finished. We could probably launch it now, I guess, if you really need it. So there's this real linguistic issue, and it's an issue of different cultures just having different languages and different working patterns. So I think one of the first things that I tried to do when I was starting to work alongside developers was train myself to understand that in reality, you have to develop that shared language, and it's on both sides to learn that if an editor comes up to you and goes, "You missed the deadline," that there's a reason why they feel that way, and likewise, if you're going, "You missed a deadline," and the other person is going, "Yeah," there's reasons for that as well.
Yeah. Other misconceptions?
Well, I thought it was very good of you to choose your words very carefully to describe coding developer, journalist, I can't remember the word. Yeah. You basically didn't make the distinction between developers and journalists, which, as we heard in the last panel, is not at all a given. You know, as Linda Sandvik says, she was made to feel like an outsider in a newsroom, right? And I think that's really important to understand that this is a form of storytelling. This is therefore a form of journalism, and that developers who just happen to produce their stories in the form of custom written code, written in JavaScript rather than English, is not, doesn't make them any less of a journalist in a newsroom. They can have an important role to play in the story. We mentioned the phrase service desk earlier. Like this, I think it's no coincidence that a lot of interactive type teams, developer teams in newsrooms, face very similar cultural problems to graphics teams. They often grew out of graphics teams, and graphics teams were often treated as sort of second-class citizens in newsrooms, people who were a service to the real journalists, who wrote stories and then told the graphics people what to do. That leads to poor graphics, and we've learned that over the last few years. That's become kind of a conventional wisdom that graphics desks need to have ownership over their output and need to be creatives in their own right. But the same is true of developers. Web development is a hugely creative process, and it needs to be seen as a journalistic output like any other. And that's, I think, breaking down that sort of cultural distinction in newsrooms is the single most important thing we can do.
Yeah. Creating a culture of innovation has been, sort of a buzz phrase that's been bandied about. What are some of the aspects of creating that kind of culture? What are some of the words you'd use to define a culture that sort of breeds kind of interdisciplinary innovation?
I think for us, it's finding the right balance of people being connected to what is happening elsewhere in the newsroom, but having enough freedom and autonomy to be able to tackle things on their own and be able to sort of come up with essentially pitches of new things, right? And sometimes that can happen in a group setting, but I think in our experience more often that is someone who has that exposure and the passion, usually sort of drawing some idea that they might have had in the past, all together, and be able to very quickly build a prototype that actually quickly gets everyone on the same page as to what the potential is. And so I think that's what we try to do, of not having people be overscheduled. There's no Gantt chart in our team to allow for some of that stuff to happen in a more sort of serendipitous way, and encourage relationships between developers and people on desks as well.
Speaking of those relationships, some newsrooms, including mine, have taken to sitting developers, kind of dotted throughout the newsroom, sometimes in, with an organizational purpose, sometimes maybe a little bit less so. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's absolutely necessary at the moment. I think Martin was saying that he has, these developers sitting in the newsroom, the technologists kind of sitting there. And it's something that just has to be done now. I guess, if you think about 10 years ago, I remember when I worked on news desk of the Daily Telegraph, somebody from the internet, it was announced, was going to be joining kind of our news desk, and all the slightly older journalists were kind of up in arms about it, and it sounds faintly ridiculous now. And maybe that's something that we need to do now, is just to bring people together. Proximity is just hugely important, not just in terms of culture and relationship, but just being in the mixer with somebody, somebody, that person who you speak to doesn't have two heads, they've got a backstory, and just getting to know these people and find, as Mary was saying as well, it works both ways. You've got to teach them, like, deadlines are kind of important, and perhaps that's something that doesn't always kind of occur to them, but we have to learn, their language, not just the coding language as well, the way that they work too.
So,
one thing on that is, so there was a note that went out to the newsroom at the Times a couple of years ago. They were moving a few mobile and CMS developers into the newsroom, And the person who wrote the note is, coming from a print background, said, and this is the first time we'll have developers in the newsroom.
Right.
And, I and the folks on my team sort of, at first, they were like, looked at each other a little bit, like, what, WTF?
Right.
But, I think the mostly good thing about that was that we weren't seen as just developers, right? That we were seen as a desk in the newsroom, that we are journalists who happen to have these other special skills. And I think what that sort of set the stage for, not perfectly, but I think it was in the right direction, was that there is now, I think, more of an awareness that there are different types of developers and different types of designers, in the same way that there are different types of reporters, and that we're not just seen as this kind of like one-size-fits-all, like, thing that gets stamped out of a factory, which is, I think, very helpful for everybody.
Well, and so to that point, we have an audience here. We have people who are watching out there in the world. If you could speak to the publishers, the CEOs, the people who sort of manage the structure of news organizations, what would you say about the way to really kind of put together these different types of skill sets, coding journalists, non-coding journalists, sort of the right way to structure an organization to sort of unlock the full potential of all of these groups?
It's a tricky one, but I think one of the most important things is to get people talking. And actually, organizational culture plays such a huge part in building collaboration and building collaborative approaches. When we met a couple of days ago, I was talking about this idea that back when everybody, certainly in legacy newsrooms, back when the newspaper was printed and there wasn't really any internet around, everybody in the newsroom understood how the newspaper got printed, at least the basics, and everybody in the print works understood how ads got sold, and everybody in the sales team understood the basics of how the journalism happened. And now we work in systems that are so much more complex. Pretty much every single one of those systems has fragmented and become massive and really complex and different based on the organization. And I don't think that a lot of people in each of those areas, in each of the kind of commercial, technology, editorial areas, necessarily understand each other's jobs very well anymore. And if you don't know what your counterparts in other bits of the organization do at the very basic level, it becomes very, very difficult to even come up with the simplest of ideas about how you might work together. That feels like something that's kind of important. Part of our jobs, I think, has to be knowing at least the basics of how all of the organization functions.
I think it's just getting people together. I think we were saying as well in that talk, you could have another debate about newsroom structures, on its own. Basically, how is a newsroom structure? Everybody obviously can't sit next to each other. It's clearly impossible. But I just think a bit like, the news, like 10 years ago, they had to crash together. And actually, it's going the other way now, where it's like, actually, well, we need to kind of split it back up again, perhaps. With the technologists, with the coders, with the journalists, they just have to come together, and it may be a little bit of a crash, and it may be slightly messy, but I think just working, as I said, being in the mix with somebody, finding out, their issues, finding out our issues, you can learn so much more, and then in a few years' time, it may not be them and us. It still does feel kind of there. I don't know if you would agree with that, that the rest of the people on the panel is still them and us, but hopefully, by being in the mix together, it won't be in a few years' time.
Yeah. I think one piece of advice to sort of board level media executives would be realize that you probably already have all the necessary skills for this in your organization, but because it's been siloed off into the technology department, it's not being used for content creation. So if two of the first two developers who joined my team in the newsroom had been working at the FT for a number of years, but in technology jobs. They weren't content producers. They weren't seen as journalists. But they were already employees of the organization, and I'm sure that's true in most news organizations. We've got teams of developers who are basically paid to keep the lights on the servers, right? And they, many of them are in the organization because they are fascinated by news and they want to work in a newsroom. And this is as close as they'll be allowed, right? So find those people, identify them, and encourage them, right? Because they're probably already your employees.
I think on the being open to what they have to say as well. Journalism as we practice it has evolved, but has hundreds of years of history behind it. Software development, 5 decades or so, and then anything we're doing at the intersection of this is what maybe you might be able to stretch it out to 20, but really in the last 10 years or so. And as these newer professions, are still figuring out what they, how they're working, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to experiment with these models. And I think it's fair to say that with the shift to digital, that the best structure of the newsroom of the future is going to look more like the way these kinds of teams are structured than a traditional print desk with an 8 p.m. first edition deadline.
Right. What do you think that that sort of non-coding journalists, the folks who have been covering a beat, maybe the same one for the for some years, ought to know about the experience of people who do code in their newsrooms that would help make this kind of collaboration happen more efficiently?
I mean, first of all, I think what we just need to kind of, as I said in my presentation, was just show the good stuff that's been done. Yeah. And, they will have, there may be a specialist in a particular, business or financial area has got all this knowledge in his or her head, and it's just like this person who you can work with can untap that knowledge, yeah? You don't have to understand, everything what they're doing, obviously, all the coding licks and whatever, but it's that's why I was talking about in terms of matrix management, where, you don't have those people sitting next to each other and they would never dream of speaking to each other. So that's where we kind of have to tear that down in that sense, where you would go to your editor and say, well, I've got an idea for a story, and then he would submit that story to another editor, and then it would go through the desk. Yeah. And it might go through 5 or 6 people. Well, why don't you just, wander over to the graphic? That's what I've tried to encourage, is just like wander over to the graphics desk if you've got an idea, have a word with the team, and then, then we can thrash it out, and we'll be honest if we say it doesn't work, and then if something does work, then we think, well, who's going to run this, who's in charge, keeping the team small, and I think that works. So I don't think they have to, you don't have to know everything about what everybody else in the news organization is doing, necessarily, but I just think you need to break down barriers. That's what you need to do.
I would say, to the non-coding journalists, if someone, on one of these desks says no to your idea, it's not a repudiation of your idea, right? This is not saying your story sucks. It's saying it's not the right fit for what we're able to take on at this moment in time. And that, because we are so resource constrained, and the process for figuring out what we work on is pretty intricate, that, this, like, come back again, it's okay.
But also, if you're a commission editor, you'll say no to somebody if you're writing something. So it's perfectly
exactly.
right. I think
they're used to getting rejected.
No, well, they used to, but this is where we're talking about level playing fields. There may be that perception that you do everything that I say, which I think I've certainly got from graphics and video people, where they'll just say, well, that doesn't really work, and then the old school journalist gets all huffety and gets like, well, how dare you kind of like dismiss my work, because it's obviously a brilliant idea. And I think that's the issue, is that we're all the same. No one's kind of better than the other. So that's just one insight for me.
I think one thing that I think people who have worked running traditional news desks often don't appreciate is how difficult it is to pivot a team like this. The moving parts are much more complex. It's not like reassigning a reporter and say, get off your long-term project for a day and do this breaking news story. You can't really do that with even video teams kind of face this problem, but certainly interactive teams, there may be dependencies that you're not even aware of. Technology, technology jobs that need to be completed in another part of the business, perhaps, in order to make something work that can't just be put on ice. The flexibility of a team like this is a lot less than a traditional news desk, and that also comes down to the fact that the people in teams like this aren't completely interchangeable. This is another thing that I think a lot of journalists fail to really understand, is the diversity of skills involved in a team like this. If a particular person is off on holiday, you can't just take another person and replace them like with like.